The early morning sun streamed through the large glass windows of JFK Airport's Terminal 4, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Marcus Thompson Jr. stood in line at the check-in counter, his small leather backpack hanging from one shoulder. At just 12 years old, he looked like any other kid in his plain blue jeans, white sneakers, and a simple black t-shirt. But Marcus wasn't just any other kid. "Next, please," called the airline agent, her voice tired from the morning rush. Marcus stepped forward, pulling his passport and ticket from his backpack. The agent, whose name tag read Patricia, looked around expectantly for an adult. "Are you traveling alone, sweetheart?" "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied politely, sliding his documents across the counter. "I'm an unaccompanied minor flying to Los Angeles." Patricia's eyes widened slightly as she looked at the ticket. "First class?" She glanced at Marcus's casual clothes again, confusion crossing her face. "My father arranged it," Marcus explained simply, remembering Dad's words from their conversation the previous night. In their vast penthouse overlooking Central Park, Marcus Thompson Sr. had sat his son down for what he called a life lesson. At 52, the elder Thompson was a powerful man who had built Atlantic Airways from the ground up. Though few people knew his face, he preferred to work behind the scenes, teaching his son the value of humility and understanding. "Son," he had said, his deep voice serious but kind, "tomorrow's flight is more than just a trip to visit your grandmother. It's a chance for you to see the world as it really is." Marcus remembered nodding, not fully understanding at the time. His father had continued, "I want you to dress normally. No expensive clothes, no fancy watch. Just be yourself." "But why, Dad?" Marcus had asked, curious about this unusual request. His father's eyes had grown distant, remembering something from his past. "Because sometimes, Marcus, the world judges a book by its cover. And it's important for you to understand how that feels, even if it's uncomfortable." Now, standing at the check-in counter, Marcus understood a little better. Patricia was still processing his ticket, her fingers hovering uncertainly over her keyboard. "I'll need to verify some information," she said, picking up her phone. Marcus waited patiently, watching other travelers rush past with their rolling suitcases and coffee cups. A family with 2 kids about his age walked by, the children dressed in expensive clothes, their parents guiding them toward the first-class lounge. Nobody gave them a second look. After a few minutes, Patricia's demeanor changed completely. Her eyes grew wide, and she quickly printed Marcus's boarding pass with trembling hands. "I'm so sorry for the delay, Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice now overly sweet. "Would you like an escort to the first-class lounge?" "No, thank you," Marcus replied, remembering more of his father's words. "I can find my way." As he walked through the terminal, Marcus thought about his father's empire. Atlantic Airways had grown into one of the largest airlines in the country, yet Marcus Thompson Sr. remained largely unknown to the public. He preferred to let his work speak for itself, teaching his son the same principles of quiet dignity and strength. Marcus found a quiet corner in the regular waiting area instead of going to the first-class lounge. He pulled out his book, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird that his father had given him, and began to read. Around him, the airport buzzed with activity, but few people noticed the young boy sitting alone, absorbed in his book. An hour later, when the boarding call came for Atlantic Airways Flight 237 to Los Angeles, Marcus packed up his things and joined the line. He stood quietly, holding his first-class boarding pass, watching people's faces as they rushed past. Some were happy, others stressed, but all were too busy with their own lives to notice him. Little did any of them know that this unassuming young boy in simple clothes was the heir to the very airline they were about to fly. And as Marcus walked toward the gate, he couldn't help but wonder what other lessons his father had planned for this journey. Something in the way Dad had hugged him goodbye told him this trip would be different from any other he had taken before. The morning sun continued to shine through the terminal windows, and Marcus Thompson Jr. stepped forward to begin what would become one of the most important days of his young life. The interior of Atlantic Airways Flight 237 gleamed under soft lighting as passengers filed aboard. Marcus Thompson Jr. waited patiently in line, his boarding pass clutched in his hand. As he approached the entrance, a flight attendant named Karen Miller greeted each passenger with a practiced smile. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and her uniform was perfectly pressed. "Welcome aboard," she said automatically, then paused as her eyes fell on Marcus. Her smile flickered for a moment. Oh, sweetie, the economy section is toward the back of the plane. Marcus held up his boarding pass. I'm in first class, seat 2A, he said politely. Karen's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose as she looked at the boarding pass. She scanned it again, then looked at Marcus's casual clothes, his simple t-shirt, jeans, and worn sneakers. There must be some mistake, she said, her voice becoming firm. Let me see that again. Behind Marcus, other passengers were starting to queue up. A businessman in an expensive suit cleared his throat impatiently. There's no mistake, Marcus said calmly, remembering his father's words about maintaining dignity. That's my assigned seat. Karen's smile had completely disappeared now. She stepped slightly in front of Marcus, blocking his path to the first-class cabin. Young man, first-class tickets are very expensive. I think there's been a mix-up at the check-in counter. The businessman behind Marcus spoke up. Is there a problem? Some of us have flights to catch. No problem, sir, Karen said, her voice suddenly sweet again. She turned to Marcus. Why don't you head to the back, and I'll have someone sort this out? Marcus stood his ground, though his heart was beating faster. My ticket is for seat 2A, he repeated, his voice steady despite the growing tension. I'd like to go to my seat now, please. Several passengers were watching the scene unfold. Some looked uncomfortable, while others seemed annoyed at the delay. A woman in designer clothes whispered something to her husband, both of them glancing at Marcus with disapproval. Listen, Karen said, lowering her voice and leaning down to Marcus's level, I understand you might be confused, but first class is not. She paused, searching for words. Not really appropriate for someone like you traveling alone. The implications of her words hung in the air. An elderly man standing nearby frowned, clearly troubled by what he was hearing. I don't understand, Marcus said, though he did understand. All too well. What do you mean someone like me? Karen straightened up, her face flushing slightly. James, she called out to another flight attendant. Could you come here for a moment? James Burton, the head flight attendant, approached quickly. He was a tall man with graying hair and a serious expression. What seems to be the problem? This young man claims he has a first-class ticket, Karen explained, emphasizing the word claims in a way that made her doubt clear. I believe there's been an error. James looked at Marcus's boarding pass, then at Marcus himself. His expression hardened. Son, did someone give you this ticket? Or did you perhaps find it? The elderly man who had been watching stepped forward. Now see here, he began, but Marcus spoke first. The ticket is mine, he said firmly. My father bought it for me. I'm supposed to sit in 2A. And where is your father? James asked, his tone skeptical. Marcus thought about his father, the owner of this very airline, probably sitting in his office overlooking Manhattan. He thought about the lessons his dad was trying to teach him. This was one of them, wasn't it? Experiencing how the world really worked, how people really thought. He's not here, Marcus answered simply. I'm traveling alone. Well, that settles it, Karen said triumphantly. We can't have an unaccompanied minor in first class. It's against policy. Actually, Marcus replied, his voice still calm but clear enough for everyone to hear. Atlantic Airways has no such policy. I checked before my flight. The elderly man nodded approvingly, but Karen and James exchanged glances. The situation was drawing more attention now, with several first-class passengers peering out of their seats to see what was causing the delay. What none of them realized was that a woman in a simple business suit, sitting quietly in 3C, was watching the entire scene with intense interest. Sarah Chen, Vice President of Customer Experience at Atlantic Airways, reached for her phone and began typing notes, her face unreadable. The tension in the front of the aircraft grew thicker as more passengers became aware of the situation. Marcus Thompson Jr. stood quietly at the entrance to first class, his boarding pass still held firmly in his hand. The air felt heavy with unspoken words and uncomfortable glances. The elderly man who had tried to help earlier stepped forward again. His name was Dr. Robert Wilson, a retired professor who had spent his life teaching about civil rights. Young man, he said to Marcus, loud enough for everyone to hear, may I see your boarding pass? Marcus handed it over politely. Dr. Wilson studied it, then turned to Karen and James with a stern expression. This ticket is perfectly valid. I fail to see any problem here except the one you're creating. Karen's face reddened. Sir, with all due respect, this is an airline matter. Is it? Dr. Wilson interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of years of experience. Or is it something else entirely? Other passengers began to murmur. A young woman in business attire stood up from her first-class seat. I can see my seat from here, she said. 2A is empty. Why can't the boy just sit down? James Burton stepped forward, trying to take control of the situation. Everyone, please return to your seats. We're dealing with a security protocol here. He turned to Marcus. Son, I'm going to have to ask you to move to the economy section while we sort this out. Marcus thought about what his father would do in this situation. Marcus Thompson Sr. had always taught him that real strength wasn't about shouting the loudest or throwing your weight around. It was about standing firm in what you knew was right. No, sir, Marcus said clearly. I won't move to economy. My ticket is for seat 2A, and that's where I'm supposed to be. A few passengers gasped at his directness. Sarah Chen, still watching silently from 3C, continued taking notes on her phone, her expression growing increasingly concerned. Listen here, Karen said, her professional demeanor slipping. We can have some unaccompanied. She caught herself, but everyone knew what she had been about to say. Somewhat? Dr. Wilson challenged. Some child? Or were you going to say something else? The atmosphere grew even tenser. A mother in economy class covered her young daughter's ears, while some first-class passengers shifted uncomfortably in their expensive seats. Marcus took a deep breath. I understand you're doing your job, he said to Karen and James, his voice steady despite his racing heart. But I also understand that you're not treating me the same way you've treated other passengers. I've watched 3 other kids my age walk into first class with their families. The only difference is what they look like and what they're wearing. His words hung in the air like a heavy cloud. Some passengers looked down at their phones or out the windows, avoiding eye contact. Others nodded in agreement. A flight attendant named Maria Rodriguez, who had been watching from the back, finally approached. James, she said quietly, I checked the manifest. The boy is right. He's assigned to 2A. It's a valid ticket. James looked flustered. But the security risk? What security risk? Dr. Wilson demanded. The only risk I see here is to this airline's reputation. Sarah Chen watched as several passengers began recording the scene on their phones. She knew this situation was moments away from becoming a viral nightmare for Atlantic Airways. Marcus stood a little straighter. I'd like to call my father now, he said calmly. He told me to call if there were any problems. Oh, now he wants to call Daddy, Karen muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. Marcus pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over the keypad. He knew this call would change everything. His father had prepared him for this moment, had taught him to handle it with grace and dignity. But still, he hesitated for just a second. In that moment of hesitation, he looked around at all the faces watching him. Some sympathetic, some hostile, some ashamed, some just curious. He saw Dr. Wilson's encouraging nod, Maria's concerned expression, and Sarah Chen's calculating gaze. He saw Karen and James's dismissive looks, and he knew what he had to do. With steady fingers, he dialed his father's private number, the number that went straight to the owner of Atlantic Airways himself. Sarah Chen sat perfectly still in seat 3C, her fingers moving swiftly across her phone screen as she documented everything. As Vice President of Customer Experience at Atlantic Airways, she had seen her share of problems, but this was different. This was exactly what Mr. Thompson had warned her about 3 months ago. Trust me, Sarah, he had said during their private meeting, discrimination doesn't always wear a name tag. Sometimes it hides behind policies and procedures. At the time, she hadn't fully understood what he meant. Now she did. Sarah watched as Marcus dialed his phone. She knew who he was calling. She was one of the few people at Atlantic Airways who knew the truth about Marcus Thompson Jr. and his father. She had been placed on this flight for exactly this reason, though she hadn't expected the situation to unfold quite so dramatically. Karen Miller was still standing near Marcus, her arms crossed. Phones aren't allowed during boarding, she said sharply. You'll have to wait until. Let him make his call, Dr. Wilson interrupted. You've already delayed this flight by 15 minutes with your... concerns. Other passengers were getting restless. A businessman in one seat checked his watch and sighed loudly. "Some of us have connections to make," he complained. Sarah opened a new note on her phone and began typing. Asterisk flight 237, JFK to LAX time, 10:45 a.m. Incident in progress. FA Karen Miller. Displaying clear bias. Head FA James Burton. Supporting discriminatory behavior. FA Maria Rodriguez. Attempted to verify facts. Multiple witnesses recording. Dr. Wilson, passenger, actively supporting minor. Other passengers, 60% uncomfortable, 30% indifferent, 10% hostile asterisk. She looked up as Marcus spoke into his phone. "Dad? Yes, there's a situation." His voice was calm, but Sarah could hear the slight tremor in it. This was, after all, just a 12-year-old boy dealing with something no child should have to face. James Burton stepped forward, suddenly looking nervous. "Son, phone calls aren't." But Marcus continued speaking. "They won't let me sit in my assigned seat. They think there's been a mistake." He paused, listening. "Yes, seat 2A, no, they haven't checked the passenger manifest properly." Sarah watched Karen's face closely. The flight attendant was still trying to maintain her authority, but uncertainty had crept into her expression. Sarah added to her notes. Asterisk F.A. Miller showing first signs of doubt. Still no recognition of bias. Classic example of systemic discrimination masked as protocol. Asterisk. The cabin grew quiet as Marcus listened to his father. Sarah knew what was coming. She had been briefed about this possibility, about how Mr. Thompson wanted to handle such a situation if it arose. She also knew that her report would be crucial in the coming changes at Atlantic Airways. Sarah noticed a young girl, maybe 7 or 8, watching from economy class. The girl tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered loudly, "Mommy, why won't they let that boy sit down?" The mother hushed her daughter. The question hung in the air, its innocent clarity cutting through all the adult pretenses and prejudices. Suddenly, Marcus's voice changed. He held out his phone to James. "My father would like to speak with you." James took the phone reluctantly. "This is James Burton, head flight attendant, and phones really aren't." He stopped mid-sentence, his face draining of color. Sarah started a timer on her watch. She knew exactly what Mr. Thompson was saying. She had helped draft the message herself. Direct, powerful, and impossible to misinterpret. Karen leaned closer to James, trying to hear the conversation. Around them, passengers had gone completely silent, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Sarah made her final notes. Asterisk time from initial confrontation to resolution, 17 minutes. Number of policies violated by crew, 4. Number of witnesses, 27. Potential social media impact, high. Training implications, severe. Recommendation, complete overhaul of customer service protocols asterisk. She watched as James's hand began to shake slightly, still holding the phone to his ear. The next few moments would change everything, not just for this flight, but for Atlantic Airways as a whole. Sarah Chen sat back in her seat, knowing she was witnessing a turning point in the airline's history. The message coming through that phone was about to turn this small act of discrimination into a powerful lesson that would reshape the entire company. The silence in the aircraft was broken only by the faint sound of Marcus Thompson Sr.'s voice coming through the phone. James Burton's face had turned pale, and sweat began to form on his forehead. Karen Miller stood nearby, her earlier confidence completely gone as she watched her colleague's reaction. "Yes, sir. I understand, sir. We were just following." James stuttered, but Mr. Thompson's voice cut him off. Suddenly, the airplane's intercom system crackled to life. The pilot's voice came through. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We're about to receive a message from Atlantic Airways headquarters. Please pay attention." The intercom clicked again, and a new voice filled the cabin, deep, authoritative, and calm. "Good morning. This is Marcus Thompson Sr., owner and CEO of Atlantic Airways." Karen's eyes widened in shock. She looked at Marcus, then at the phone in James's trembling hand, then back at Marcus. The young boy stood a little straighter, though he wasn't smiling. I'm speaking to everyone on Flight 237, but particularly to my flight crew," Mr. Thompson continued. "The young man you've been refusing to seat in first class is my son, Marcus Thompson, Jr., but that's not why you should be ashamed of your actions today." The passengers sat in stunned silence. Dr. Wilson nodded slowly, a knowing smile on his face. Sarah Chen continued taking notes, though she already knew what was coming. "You see," Mr. Thompson's voice resonated through the cabin, "it shouldn't matter whose son he is. It shouldn't matter what he's wearing or what he looks like. The only thing that should matter is that he's a passenger with a valid ticket, deserving of the same respect you give to every other passenger." A woman in first class covered her mouth with her hand. The businessman who had been complaining about the delay sank lower in his seat. "What's happening today isn't just about my son. It's about every person who has ever been judged unfairly, who has ever been made to feel less than worthy because of how they look or what they wear." Marcus watched as Karen's face flushed red with embarrassment. James was still holding the phone, looking like he wanted to disappear. "To my son," Mr. Thompson continued, his voice softening slightly, "I'm proud of how you handled yourself today. You showed the dignity and strength I'd always tried to teach you." Several passengers turned to look at Marcus with new eyes. The young girl in economy who had asked the innocent question earlier whispered to her mother, "See, I told you he belonged there." To my flight crew involved in this incident, Mr. Thompson's voice turned stern again. "You'll be met by our HR department upon landing. We will be reviewing your actions and making appropriate decisions about your future with Atlantic Airways." Maria Rodriguez, the flight attendant who had tried to help, stepped forward. "Marcus," she said gently, "please, let me show you to your seat." As Marcus finally moved toward seat 2A, Mr. Thompson delivered his final message. "To all our passengers, I apologize for the delay and the scene you've witnessed. But I hope this serves as a reminder that dignity, respect, and fair treatment are not privileges reserved for some. They are basic rights that belong to all." The intercom fell silent. The cabin remained quiet for a moment before breaking into scattered applause. Dr. Wilson stood up and shook Marcus's hand as he passed. "Well done, young man. Well done indeed." Sarah Chen watched as Karen and James huddled together near the galley, their faces showing the dawning realization of what had just happened. She made her final note: "Incident concluded. Intervention successful. Recommend immediate implementation of new training protocols." Marcus settled into his seat, placing his backpack carefully under the seat in front. He looked out the window, thinking about his father's words. This hadn't been just about him. It had been about something much bigger. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again, this time with its usual professional tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're ready for departure. Flight attendants, please prepare for takeoff." As the aircraft began to push back from the gate, Marcus felt different. He wasn't just Marcus Thompson Jr. anymore. He had become part of something important. A lesson that would change not just one flight, but an entire airline. As Flight 237 reached its cruising altitude, the atmosphere in the cabin had changed completely. The first-class section, usually filled with quiet conversation and the clicking of laptop keys, remained unusually silent. Every passenger was lost in their own thoughts about what they had just witnessed. Marcus sat in his seat, 2A, looking out at the clouds below. A flight attendant, not Karen or James, who had been moved to the back of the plane, brought him a glass of apple juice. "I'm so sorry about what happened," she whispered. Her name tag read Lisa. "It's okay," Marcus replied softly. "My dad says sometimes the hardest lessons are the most important ones." Dr. Wilson, seated across the aisle, overheard this exchange. The elderly professor leaned over slightly. "Your father is a wise man, Marcus, but I'm curious, how did you feel during all of this?" Marcus thought for a moment, remembering his father's words from their many conversations about facing prejudice. "I felt disappointed," he said finally. "Not angry, just sad that people still judge others this way." Sarah Chen, still in seat 3C, continued to observe and take notes. She watched as other passengers nearby pretended not to listen, but their turned heads and quiet attention revealed their interest. "You know," Dr. Wilson said, loud enough for others to hear, "I've been teaching about civil rights for 40 years, but sometimes a single moment can teach more than 1,000 lectures." He gestured around the cabin. "Look at everyone here. They're all thinking, all reflecting. That's how change begins. A businessman who had earlier complained about the delay spoke up from his seat. I want to apologize, he said, his voice heavy with regret. I was impatient. I should have spoken up when I saw what was happening. Other passengers began to join the conversation. A woman in her 30s admitted she had seen the discrimination but had been afraid to say anything. A young college student confessed he had assumed Marcus was in the wrong seat too, and felt ashamed of his prejudice. Sarah Chen watched as the discussion grew, transforming the first-class cabin into an impromptu forum on bias and responsibility. This was exactly what Mr. Thompson had hoped would happen, not just a confrontation, but a conversation. Marcus, she finally spoke, revealing her role. Your father and I have been working on new training programs for our staff. Would you be willing to share your experience as part of that training? The other passengers looked surprised at this revelation. Marcus nodded thoughtfully. Dad always says that bad experiences can become good lessons if we learn from them. From the back of the plane, they could see Karen and James sitting quietly in the crew area, their faces showing the weight of their actions. Maria Rodriguez was speaking to them softly, likely explaining what this incident would mean for the airline's future. The hardest part about prejudice, Dr. Wilson explained to the now attentive cabin, is that sometimes people don't even realize they're being prejudiced. They think they're following rules or being cautious, when really they're just reinforcing old biases. A young mother from economy class had brought her daughter forward to use the bathroom. The little girl stopped near Marcus's seat. Are you really the owner's son? She asked innocently. Marcus smiled. Yes, but that's not what's important. What's important is that everyone should be treated fairly, no matter who they are. The mother took her daughter's hand, tears in her eyes. Thank you, she said to Marcus. My daughter will remember this day. Sarah Chen made a final note in her phone. Recommendation: create youth education program about equality and fairness in customer service. Possible name: the Marcus Thompson Initiative. As the plane continued its journey westward, the lesson continued to unfold. Passengers shared stories of times they had faced or witnessed discrimination. Others spoke about times they wished they had done more to help. The first-class cabin had become a place of learning, understanding, and hope for change. Marcus looked out at the clouds again, thinking about how his father had turned an uncomfortable situation into a powerful teaching moment. He knew that this flight was just the beginning. There would be more lessons, more changes, and hopefully, more understanding to come. The plane touched down at Los Angeles International Airport under a bright California sun. As passengers began gathering their belongings, Sarah Chen was already on her phone, coordinating with airline officials waiting at the gate. This incident would reshape Atlantic Airways, and the work would begin immediately. All passengers, please remain seated, the pilot announced as they taxied to the gate. We have some special instructions for deplaning. Marcus could see several people in suits through the terminal windows as they approached the gate. He recognized Janet Morrison, the airline's head of human resources, among them. His father had clearly set things in motion. As the aircraft came to a stop, Sarah Chen stood up. Ladies and gentlemen, she addressed the cabin, I'm Sarah Chen, Vice President of Customer Experience at Atlantic Airways. Due to today's incident, we'll be following a special deplaning procedure. Karen and James were asked to leave first, escorted by two of the waiting airline officials. Karen's earlier arrogance had been replaced by quiet resignation, while James kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with everyone. They would be heading straight to a meeting that would decide their future with the company. Dr. Wilson stood up next, gathering his belongings. Marcus, he said, handing the boy a business card, if you ever need a voice in academia to speak about this experience, please contact me. What happened today needs to be shared. Other passengers began to deplane, many stopping to shake Marcus's hand or offer words of support. The businessman who had apologized earlier handed Marcus his card too. I'm on the board of several companies, he explained. They'd all need to hear this story. The young mother and her daughter from economy class passed by again. The little girl waved at Marcus, and her mother smiled. We'll be riding to the airline, she said. Not to complain, but to commend your bravery and your father's wisdom. Sarah Chen approached Marcus as the cabin emptied. Your father is waiting in the terminal, she said kindly. But before we go out there, I want you to know something. She paused, making sure she had his full attention. What happened today will change things. We've been documenting discriminatory incidents for months, but seeing it happen to you, watching how you handled it, that's going to make the difference we needed." Through the windows, Marcus could see news vans pulling up to the terminal. Someone had leaked the story, and media outlets were already gathering. Maria Rodriguez, who had shown kindness during the incident, touched his shoulder gently. "Are you ready for this?" she asked. "There's quite a crowd out there." Marcus thought about everything his father had taught him about handling difficult situations. "Yes," he said firmly. "Dad always says that change doesn't happen in the shadows. It happens when people are brave enough to stand in the light." As they prepared to leave the aircraft, Sarah showed Marcus some of the social media activity already spreading across the internet. Videos of the incident had been uploaded by several passengers, and hashtag Atlantic Airways was trending. But unlike many viral stories about discrimination, this one came with immediate accountability and a clear message of change. The last passenger to leave was a teenage girl who had been sitting quietly in economy class. She stopped beside Marcus. "I'm in high school," she said, "and I'm giving a speech next week about systemic racism. Would you mind if I talked about what happened today?" Marcus smiled and nodded. "That's exactly what should happen," he said. "The more people who understand, the better things can become." As they finally stepped into the terminal, cameras flashed and reporters called out questions. But Marcus walked calmly beside Sarah Chen, head held high, just as his father had taught him. He saw Mr. Thompson standing at the end of the jet bridge, proud smile on his face. This was more than just an incident now. It had become a moment of transformation, not just for Atlantic Airways, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The videos would be shared, the story would be told, and most importantly, real changes would be made. Behind them, the crew was preparing the aircraft for its next flight. But Flight 237 would be remembered as more than just another journey from New York to Los Angeles. It would be remembered as the day when one boy's dignity, one father's wisdom, and one company's commitment to change came together to create something powerful. 3 months after the incident on Flight 237, Marcus Thompson Jr. stood beside his father in Atlantic Airways' main training center. The large room was filled with new flight attendants, pilots, and ground staff, all watching attentively as a video played on the screen. It was footage from that memorable flight, now part of the airline's mandatory training program. That day changed everything, Marcus told the trainees after the video ended. "Not because of who my father is, but because it showed how quickly prejudice can hide behind rules and procedures." The training center had been completely redesigned. One wall now displayed a large photo of Marcus in his simple t-shirt and jeans, standing proud next to his seat 2A. Below it were the words, "Judge by character, not appearance." Sarah Chen stepped forward to address the group. "In the past 3 months, Atlantic Airways has made significant changes. We've revised our training, updated our policies, and most importantly, we've created a new culture of inclusion." The numbers on the screen behind her told the story. 1,500 employees retrained. 200 new inclusive policies implemented. 0 tolerance for discrimination. 24-hour reporting hotline established. Customer satisfaction up 40%. Karen Miller and James Burton's story had also become part of the training. They hadn't been fired. Instead, at Marcus Sr.'s suggestion, they had been given a choice. They could either leave the company or help create the new training program, sharing their story and what they had learned. Both chose to stay and become part of the solution. "I was wrong," Karen told the trainees, her voice different now, humbler. "I thought I was following protocol, but I was really following my own prejudices. I'm grateful for the chance to help others learn from my mistake." Dr. Wilson had become a regular consultant for the airline, helping develop educational materials about unconscious bias. The elderly professor's expertise, combined with Marcus's experience, created powerful teaching tools that other airlines began requesting to use. Maria Rodriguez had been promoted to head of customer relations, where she worked closely with Sarah Chen to implement new service standards. "Every passenger deserves respect," she would tell her teams. "Every single one." The little girl from economy class and her mother had been invited back to help create a children's version of the training program, teaching young passengers about equality and respect. The program would soon be implemented in schools across the country. Marcus walked through the training center, looking at the changes his experience had sparked. New signs hung everywhere. Respect has no dress code. First class is about the ticket, not the person. Judge less. Welcome more. His father joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. You know, son, Marcus Sr. said quietly, when I put you on that flight, I knew something might happen, but I never expected it would create such big changes. Marcus nodded. That's because you taught me the right way to handle it, Dad. Not with anger, but with dignity. The businessman who had apologized on the flight had kept his word. He had shared the story with his corporate boards, leading to similar training programs being adopted by companies across different industries. The video had gone viral, been featured on national news, and sparked important conversations about discrimination in customer service. Atlantic Airways had become a model for other companies. Their new slogan, "Everyone flies first class in dignity," had transformed their image. Customer complaints about discrimination had dropped to zero, while customer loyalty had soared. As Marcus watched the new trainees practicing scenarios, learning to check their biases, and understanding the importance of equal treatment, he felt proud. His uncomfortable experience had become a force for positive change. Next week, Sarah Chen announced to the group, "We're launching the Marcus Thompson Initiative in schools nationwide. We'll be teaching children about equality, respect, and standing up for what's right." The training session ended with a question that had become standard in Atlantic Airways' new program. What would you do differently? Each trainee had to think carefully about their own biases and how they would handle similar situations. Marcus Sr. addressed the group one final time. "Remember," he said, "change doesn't just happen in big moments. It happens in small decisions, every day, with every passenger you meet." As they left the training center that evening, Marcus saw a new flight crew boarding a bus for the airport. Each of them wore a small pin that read, 237, the flight that changed us all. The incident that began with a boy being denied his rightful seat had grown into something much bigger, a movement that was changing not just one airline, but the way people thought about dignity, respect, and the power of standing up for what's right.